The puppy was nondescript, maybe 8 weeks old. Tiger coloring, mostly boxer, but you could see there were other breeds in the mix. He noticed the woman looking at him through the bars and turned on the puppy charm, wagging his tail and moving toward the front of the cage. The woman slipped her hand into the cage and the dog licked it, hoping that was the ticket to finding a permanent home. The look in the woman's eyes told the puppy he was on the right track. He wagged his tail and licked her even harder. The woman's eyes opened wide, tears welling up in the inner corners of her eyes. She turned to the man kneeling behind her. "Yes, this guy right here," she said. "And you're going to feed him and walk him and take care of him?" he said, his voice so full of disbelief that the puppy could almost understand it. "Well, yeah, he'll be my little buddy, follow me everywhere, protect me and all that," she said. He rolled his eyes, not trying to hide his pessimism. She'd made promises like that before, and almost every time he'd been responsible for everything she wanted to do. Gardening, cooking, hanging out with a Nigerian 6th grader, you name it. He really didn't want to take care of the dog as well, but what could he say? You do everything for the ones you love. "Okay, we'll take that big-eyed one that's looking at her from the cage," Bryce England said to the man at the animal shelter. "Wrap him up and put a bow on him." "You can't pick him up today. He has to be sterilized first," the shelter worker said. "We can do that tomorrow, and if everything goes well, you can pick him up the day after tomorrow." "Hank," Faith England said to the man who gave her a puzzled look, "we'll take Hank home the day after tomorrow." "Right," he smiled, furtively trying to peek up her blouse as he rose from his knees behind her husband. Bryce caught that attempt to peek up her blouse and smirked to himself. This was hardly the first time some rogue had tried to look up his big-breasted wife's blouse. She probably didn't even notice anymore since it was trivial, something of an occupational hazard. The animal grew from a puppy to a rather large dog. Faith had taken care of it for the first 3 weeks, and then she had gradually shifted her duties to Bryce. As the latter took over the dog's care, the animal gradually shifted its devotion to Bryce. Faith still liked him, but dogs have an even simpler arrangement than humans. Their first attachment is to the one who feeds and cares for them. "See, you're the one who should take care of him since he likes you best," she had once said when he reminded her of her promise to take care of the dog. "He likes me best precisely because I take care of him," Bryce snorted. "Dogs are very easy. You women, on the other hand." Faith knew where this was going. She fluttered her eyelashes at her husband of 10 years and flared her impressive breasts in her tight pink top. Bryce was practically drooling. "Men are so simple," she thought to herself. Faith knew that the hardest part of this relationship was her. She knew that they wouldn't become less complicated in the near future, and she realized that her husband didn't deserve the pain that was coming. Faith and Bryce had recently celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. Bryce thought he had the perfect wife and the perfect marriage. Sure, the couple fought sometimes, but never over something important. For example, he was a Cubs fan and Faith loved the White Sox. That's probably the biggest topic of contention, he thought. But he thought wrong. Vera is an assistant vice president at an international insurance company. She has worked at WorldX Re for 9 years, with Anand Patel as her immediate boss for the last 6. They worked well together professionally and became good friends. Faith and Bryce even spent time together with Anand and his wife outside of the office. Bryce liked the man. For 3 years, Faith and Anand were nothing more than co-workers and friends. She thought her boss was pleasant, charming, and handsome. He was 45, fit, with black hair with sagebrush the color of salt and pepper and big brown eyes. His Indian ancestry gave him a light brown complexion, and his training in the UK gave him a typical British accent of the highest sort. His baritonal voice gave him an almost lawyer type of honeyed speech. Vera had never considered cheating on Bryce. She thought her husband was just as handsome as her boss. He had light brown hair and large, expressive blue eyes. He spent several evenings at the gym and looked accordingly. He fit the profile of a chartered accountant perfectly, being quiet and thoughtful. He didn't hold himself very well socially, but Faith knew that his love for her knew no bounds. Vera knew that he was also quite skillful in bed. Vera and Anand would occasionally go out to lunch and talk business. Over time, this evolved into talking about their personal lives. It wasn't until a few years later that the couple began meeting for lunch for purely personal reasons, and it quickly became the norm. Anand knew that women found him desirable, but he was not a serial skirt hunter. He had only cheated twice before in his marriage. Neither he nor Vera had any plans to take this friendship further until it happened. About 6 months after they began their private dinners, the couple found themselves in bed in a hotel during a long lunch break. Vera was surprised that after her first liaison with Anand, guilt did not gnaw at her. They had made love twice that first time, and both of them had enjoyed it immensely. They hadn't done anything she hadn't done before with Bryce. But the fact that it was the first time in a dozen years having sex with someone other than her husband made it very arousing. Her body was both lush and taut, and her large breasts were certainly a thing of beauty. The couple waited a week before arranging a second date. In the opinion of both, it was no worse than the first. Indeed, even better as they explored each other's bodies and what each of them liked. Sex became weekly, often changing days of the week so that Bryce couldn't keep track of it. Faith used her excellent management skills to keep everything in order. Although she was always worried that her husband would find out, after a few weeks it even began to amuse her that she was able to hide her affair from him so easily. She felt superior and, frankly, smarter than her clueless husband. Faith wasn't fooled that she wasn't the one having an affair. However, she felt that it did not take an iota of love away from her husband. She felt a surge of energy in her marriage as well as in her life. She has her husband's love, and she also has a relationship with her lover. Though she didn't love Anand the way she loved Bryce, she knew her feelings for him were much more than simple lust. Faith made sure to stay with Bryce and give him absolutely every ounce of love she thought he wanted or needed. It seemed to her that she and her husband were closer than ever, and she would certainly know if he guessed what was going on. At the same time, she still felt some tension forcing her to keep her two lives separate. Since she worked alongside her spouse, Vera and her lover didn't have much time to do anything else but have amazing sex when they were together. Both knew they had other interests and wanted to explore them further, but she knew Anand wanted to spend more time with her, but realized that wasn't going to happen unless her husband went out of town, and that rarely happened. She decided it was a wonderful problem to have two attractive men loving her. When Bryce found out a few months later, he was less optimistic. One evening, when he was alone because Faith had to stay late at work, he grabbed his wife's iPad from the table next to his lazy boy chair, a lounge chair with a leg extension, instead of getting up and grabbing his laptop from his home office. When he logged into Amazon Prime to order some books, two addresses appeared in the Deliver to Address field. The first was the England's home address, but the second belonged to Anand Patel, Vera's boss, and it wasn't his usual home address. Bryce's eyes widened considerably when he looked at the second address. His immediate reaction was a feeling of nausea in his stomach, but that feeling quickly turned to rage. He screamed, and his scream reverberated off all four walls surrounding him. Then he walked over to his liquor cabinet, poured himself a double shot of single malt whiskey, and started making plans. The biggest problem for Bryce was that just a few minutes ago, he would have told anyone and everyone that he loved his wife to bits. And that feeling hadn't evaporated despite her cheating. If further investigation showed that she had in fact cheated, he would have to sort through his reaction and see if they could move on as a married couple. About an hour later, Faith came home humming as she walked through the door. For the first time that Bryce could remember, he didn't jump up from his seat and rush over to her for a welcoming kiss. It didn't escape Faith's notice either. "Hey, honey, is everything okay?" she asked, walking over to Bryce, who was sitting in his lazy boy reading the sports section of the newspaper. "Not even close," Bryce mumbled, turning his head so that Faith's kiss meant for his lips landed on his cheek. Faith stepped back and looked at her husband intently. For the first time, she wondered if he had somehow found out about her affair. Bryce caught the look out of the corner of his eye and realized he needed to keep his cool until he could formulate a plan. It wasn't in his nature to act without preparation. Suddenly feeling unsure of herself, Faith decided that caution was the better part of valor and didn't continue the conversation. She made a mental note to herself to pay more attention to her husband's moods. Perhaps she was taking him for granted. The next day at work, Bryce called his good friend, who was a former attorney. After Bryce explained his problem, the friend called his best investigator and got him involved. 2 weeks later, Bryce had confirmation of his wife's infidelity, including photos and video. "So what now, amigo?" his friend asked him. For the first time since his parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, Bryce cried openly. Faith tried to be inconspicuous, but she watched her husband closely for the next few days after he didn't greet her that evening. She knew there wasn't an ounce of guile in Bryce and felt she would quickly find out if he suspected she was having an affair. Faith even mentally called it an affair. She knew it was wrong, but at the same time she couldn't convince herself that it was bad, especially since she wasn't neglecting Bryce in the slightest. After a few days of watching her husband, the only difference Faith could notice was in the bedroom. Bryce usually initiated sex as often as she did, but for the next week he made no attempt at intimacy. When she made it herself a couple days later, he seemed reluctant, but then showed physical power like he'd never shown before, pounding into her mattress that night, and he'd pounded into her hard every time she initiated since. Bryce's newfound physical power in the bedroom was his only way to vent his growing hatred of his wife's cheating. He had stopped soliciting sex from Vera, but when she initiated it, he would do anything to get his own very powerfully. He was surprised she didn't pick up on his anger. Not only that, she seemed to be enjoying this new Bryce. Her last semi-conscious thought was that she was the luckiest woman in the world, having 2 studs. Bryce had his attorney draw up the divorce papers for adultery, even though in a no-fault state it made no financial difference. Divorcing his wife would be pretty fair since they make the same amount of money and don't have children yet. They would have to sell the house and split all the profits. "I know it sounds crazy, but just hold the papers until I tell you," Bryce explained. "I want to let this go on for a while longer and maybe she'll come to her senses. I love that stupid bitch, and maybe with some counseling." "Are you at least going to demand an explanation?" John Jefferson asked. "That would probably end things quicker." "Probably not. You know how stubborn Vera can be? If I have to interfere, she'll just push back even harder. Everything has to come from her, and then maybe we'll have a chance." "You're the boss. You tell me when. The papers will last as long as Twinkies." A year later, Bryce was completely amazed that his supposedly intelligent wife didn't notice the crack that had appeared between them. Gone were the little touches and glances between them. Intimacy had dwindled to once a week, and when they were intimate, it was down to the trivial. Though Faith might not have known it, Bryce noted that they hadn't made love since he'd found out about the affair. He was also amazed that Faith was able to continue pretending to be a faithful wife. She seemed to have been able to successfully advance her career, maintain a solid romance, and keep up with all of her hobbies and social activities. When he thought about it, he had to admit that it was all quite impressive. Since Bryce seemed reluctant to pull the divorce trigger, things could have gone on for a long time, but fate intervened in the form of Anand's promotion. He had been promoted to a director position in the company's London office, and he was due to leave in a month. Vera was devastated by this development, though professionally she was happy for her lover. "Maybe this is the God's way of telling us that it's time to end our relationship," Anand said. "We've been doing this for 3 years now, and we've never been caught. I'd say we've been very good at hiding things, and maybe we've been a little lucky." Over the next 2 weeks, both Faith and Anand shed tears several times. Bryce noted to himself that Faith seemed distracted at times. He wondered if the problem was work or her relationship with Anand. "Is something going on, babe?" he asked. Faith looked like she wanted to say something but held back and left the room. Bryce inwardly guessed that there was trouble in paradise between the lovers and smiled. Liza Patel was thrilled with both the promotion her husband had gotten and the place he'd been sent to. She had grown up in London and had family there. She took the responsibility of packing her family's belongings so that they, her 2 children, and herself would be back in London a week before Anand was due to leave. This gave the lovers a week before Anand was due to fly to London from New York. This plan seemed reasonable to Vera, but Anand was not convinced. She was to fly to New York on Friday and spend the entire weekend with Anand before he flew to London on Monday morning. The lovers could eat at nice restaurants, go to a Broadway play, and see some sights before saying goodbye one last time. The only downside to this plan was that Vera was going to tell her husband that she would be spending her last weekend with Anand. "Why tell him, Vera?" Anand asked. "Just tell him it's a business trip. He will never know." "How many business trips have I had in my years here?" "None. All of a sudden I have to go on a weekend." Bryce may be gullible, but this seems like a stretch. If I lie and get caught, Bryce and I are screwed. But if I tell him the truth and appeal to his love for me, I really think we can get through this. It might hurt him a little, but he loves me wholeheartedly, and he's the most logical guy I know. It makes more sense to tell him, she explained. "Well, if you think it's the right thing to do, you know him better than anyone," Anand said. Vera waited until the evening before she left for New York to tell her husband. After eating and clearing the table, Faith snuggled up to Bryce on the couch. As had been the custom for the past 2+ years, Bryce didn't snuggle up to her, but he didn't move away either. He seemed absorbed in watching the show. Faith waited a few minutes, then coughed. "I need to get away this weekend, Bryce," she began as she sat silently until her husband slowly acknowledged that he had heard her words. He looked at her in silence. She laid out the plan for the weekend, starting with Anand's promotion, but never admitted to the ongoing affair. "So he is leaving for good, and after this weekend we won't see him again. We have feelings for each other, and we just have to finally connect. We've had these feelings for a few years now, and we feel like this is the perfect way to end it all," Vera said. "After that, he'll be in London and I'll be here, spending the rest of our lives making it up to you. We won't write to each other, we won't talk on the phone, nothing. This will be completely over." Bryce hadn't expected such a statement. He could barely keep his mouth shut, especially when she blatantly lied about how they'd never had anything sexual. "I've been a good wife to you. You never knew anything about our relationship, and I never hid anything from you," Faith said. Bryce tried to object, but nothing came off his lips. He lowered his head and forced himself to count to 10. He thought about how much he had to say. "You can't do this, Faith," Bryce said. "I don't care what your motives are. We made a vow, and you have no right to change the rules for weekend sex with another man." "Does Liza know about this? If she does, I can't imagine she'd be any happier about it than I am. Does she even know?" Faith blushed profusely. "I don't know if Anand has told Liza. She's already gone to London." "Look, Bryce, I'm not asking your permission to do this. I'm going to do it anyway, no matter what your answer is. We can talk more about it when I get back," she said. "I think that's why you waited until the last minute to tell me. You don't need permission, just forgiveness. Baby, you know you always give in to me when we argue. Sooner or later you'll realize that it can't hurt us and you'll let me do it. Or you'll forgive me later," she said. "Not this time. This is the straw that breaks the camel's back," Bryce said. "You get on that airplane and it's over between us." Bryce's last sentence sounded like a spiked glove slapping Vera's face. If she heard Bryce's words about this being the last straw, she didn't pay any attention. Bryce thought about retiring to the guest room to sleep, but then decided he wasn't going to let his wife kick him out of her bed. He was already asleep when Faith went upstairs and climbed into bed. Bryce got up about an hour earlier than usual. Before he left, he found Vera's small suitcase ready to go on the bed in the guest room, but when he got home a little after 5 p.m., it wasn't there. He called his lawyer and had only one word to say: "Let's go." The cab to the airport stopped in front of the hotel almost just after 3 p.m. Anand carried Vera's suitcase into the car and put it in the back seat, after which the couple tearfully kissed goodbye. Except that the kiss was interrupted by a rough man patting Vera on the shoulder. The couple tried to ignore the intruder, but the man didn't like it. "Vera England? Are you Vera England?" he asked. The couple broke the embrace and both sighed in disgust. "Yes!" Vera shouted. "Mrs. England, you have been served," the man said, placing a manila envelope in her hand. The embrace was quickly forgotten. Tears rushed from Vera's eyes. She handed the envelope to Anand, who tore it open with anger. "Son of a bitch!" Anand shouted. "I thought you said he was a reasonable man, thoughtful or something. You said it wouldn't be a problem. He had to act awfully fast to serve you so quickly." Faith was crying too hard to think rationally. It was going to be a long flight home. She wasn't surprised that Bryce hadn't picked her up at the airport. She took an Uber home. Bryce sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. In Vera's place was a second cup. She took the hint and sat down, tears already starting to drip. "Please, Faith, stop the damn waterfall. I'm the one who should be crying. I'm the one who got cheated on," Bryce said. Faith raised her head upon hearing Bryce's words. The tears immediately stopped, but her blood pressure was off the charts. "It wasn't cheating. I told you what I was going to do," she said. "Did I agree to your plan?" "No. That's why you cheated. You don't get to make the rules. In this case, to change them," Bryce said. "It was just one weekend out of our entire married life," she said. 2.5 days out of thousands so far, and many thousands more to come. Do you really want to get a divorce over this?" "Actually, no. I think I could live with it, if that's the way it was," Bryce said, looking straight into his wife's eyes. For the first time, Bryce saw his wife break down. She just started doing the math in her head. "How ignorant do you think I am? This is a far cry from the first time for both of you. Yes, it was your first weekend, but you've both been sleeping together for over 2 years as far as I can tell. I gotta hand it to you. For at least 2 years, you've led a double life, the perfect wife and cheating whore. I held on, hoping you'd come to your senses and give him up, but you crossed the line with your timeless weekends." Faith felt dizzy even though she was sitting up. She took a sip of coffee, trying to gather her thoughts. "Why didn't you say anything before this? Why didn't you try to stop me?" she asked in almost a whisper. "When I found out it had been going on for quite some time, I hoped you would stop because it was wrong, and because you love me." "What a silly thing to say," he said. "But I love you," she declared. "I didn't love you any less. But I love him too. I am capable of loving you both, but you're my husband. You've always been number one." No, there is no number one because there shouldn't be a number 2 or 3 or 4, he said. "It's just you and Anand." "Well, it's just you now. He's gone and it's just you and me," Vera said. "Well, it's just you now. I'm not in the equation anymore, baby." "Oh, come on, Bryce. He's gone. There's no reason to get a divorce," Faith said. "If he hadn't left, would you have stopped sleeping with him?" Bryce said. Faith lowered her eyes. She didn't need to answer. "What made you think you could sleep with him? How did it start?" he asked. "You know Anand and you like him, don't you?" she started before Bryce interrupted her. "I did," he said. "Okay, I get it. But he's a great guy, and after you, I think he's the sexiest man I know, and it just happened." "And happened, and happened, and happened," Bryce snorted as his wife gave him a disgruntled look. "We developed real feelings for each other. It wasn't just cheap sex. You know I could never have cheap sex with someone. I love you both," Vera said. "Hey, it doesn't work like that, baby. You can't love 2 people," Bryce said. "Have I ever taken anything away from you? Have I ever denied you sex?" she asked. "Yes, you gave him something you swore would be exclusively mine. We both made vows. It's so much more than sex, baby. Trust, respect. Now that Anand's gone, I'll expect you to replace him with someone else. Because you clearly don't respect me enough to not let things happen." "Something," Bryce said. "I don't see the possibility of finding a third man in my life to love. Most people are lucky enough to find just one great love, and I've found 2. I've already exceeded my catch limit for life," Faith said. "You still don't get it, do you? The one thing I don't hear from you is an apology," he said. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I never meant to, but I just couldn't tell you because..." "Because I knew it was wrong," he interrupted. "You don't regret the affair, do you?" Bryce continued. "Honestly, no," Faith said. "I love Anand. I loved our experience together. Like I said, I have 2 men I love and who love me in return. I wouldn't trade that for anything." Bryce shook his head in bewilderment. He had expected remorse and guilt. To his shock, he got neither. "What about Liza?" he asked. "She didn't know about the affair, did she?" She didn't. Oh no, Vera said. Don't. Please don't tell me you told her everything. She didn't know. Oh God, she's going to hate me. Yeah, that's about right, Bryce said. Why did you tell her? Faith asked. She wasn't supposed to know. She had to know. We were her friends, just like we were his. Friends don't keep secrets from friends. And why shouldn't she know if it was such pure love, practically a love story for the ages? Faith clenched her fists in despair, staring at her husband. You say it sounds cheap and tasteless. It wasn't like that, she wheezed. I'm sure Liza would disagree with you, and neither would I, he said. They have 2 kids, Bryce. You're going to blow up their family, she said. Only if Liza agrees with the way I see it. If she agrees with your point of view, I think you're both safe. But if she agrees with my point of view, that still doesn't mean I'm the one who blew up their family. I wasn't the one who slept with her husband, Bryce said. The next day, there was a phone call from Anand to Faith while she was at work. Liza apparently hadn't had time to file the divorce papers yet, but when Anand showed up at his new home in London, his wife wouldn't even let him in the door. I can't believe your husband did this to me, he shouted into the phone. I thought we were friends. Yes, but I think he thought his friend shouldn't sleep with his wife for the last 3 years, Vera said. I've tried to explain it to him, but he doesn't believe me. He acts very rigid about everything. It's never happened before that he hasn't given in to me on anything. I think there's little more to it than the color of the walls in the living room, Anand said dejectedly. It was a week before Bryce got a call from Vera's parents. He'd always had a good relationship with his in-laws, made even stronger when his own parents died in a car accident. Have you thought about counseling, son? His father-in-law asked. You'd both lived for 10 years. Weren't you planning to have children soon? Yes, but now I think it's never going to happen, said Bryce. Oh no, son, don't let something small turn into something fatal, said his father-in-law. Something small? Bryce interjected. He quickly realized that Faith wasn't being forthright with her parents and realized that the rest of the conversation wasn't going to be easy. She said there was something you two didn't agree on, but she didn't say it was something vital, his father-in-law said. What we disagreed on was her long-term affair with her former boss. Did you know that they had been slept together for over 2 years? On the other end of the phone, Ralph Carville gasped. It's a shock when someone tells a father that his little girl is a cheating whore. Then Bryce heard him ask his wife if she knew about their daughter's cheating and heard her stammer, but didn't hear the answer. Damn it, Faith! He's family! How could you do this to him? He heard Ralph yelling at his wife. How long have you known this? Damn, woman. The incredibly stubborn Ralph got back on the line. I'm sorry, Bryce, I didn't know, but apparently my daughter and my wife had secrets from both of us. I know I didn't raise her to be a whore, an affair over several years, and she thought you'd go along with that? Damn it, I raised a stuck-up whore. Again, I'm sorry, Bryce. We're all sorry, Dad. Good night. Bryce couldn't believe it, but Faith fought against the divorce. It was over when Faith's lawyer offered marriage counseling and the judge chuckled. You're serious, Mr. Liston. It's perfectly clear to me that Mrs. England had a long-term sexual relationship with her then boss, and I have to assume that Mr. England didn't want that. Frankly, only an idiot would agree to counseling after what he went through. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. The only point of contention in the divorce was Hank the dog. Bryce assumed that the dog would go with him, but Faith insisted that the dog stay with her because Bryce had given the dog to her. Finally, Bryce relented, but as he drove away from the house, Hank jumped into the front seat next to the driver in Bryce's car. Faith called out repeatedly before forcefully pulling the big dog out, only to see him jump back in. Keep the fucking dog, you bastard! Faith shouted. Bryce noted to himself that it was the first profanity he'd ever heard from his ex-wife.